would argue that approaching the summit of knowledge on forests and communities has not always taken the most direct and efficient path. Over the last quarter century, we've probably spent the equivalent of at least a few years just debating terminology. Is it community forestry, participatory forestry, social forestry, community-based forest management, joint forest management, co-management? More than 20 years ago, I remember spending a couple of hours debating with Indonesian colleagues whether it was perhutanan sosial or kehutanan sosial in Bahasa Indonesia, and I confess that I still don't understand the difference. Another thing that has slowed us down is what I'll call the tyranny of the case study. Earlier this year, CIFOR, CIRAD, and IRD convened a seminar in Montpellier to take stock of research on smallholder and community forestry. Those who started with the presumptions that communities are inherently more virtuous stewards of forest resources had case studies to prove their point. And those who believed that communities are rational actors who will destroy forests if their incentives are aligned to do so had case studies to prove their point as well. Participants in the seminar identified two needs that I strongly endorse and that I'll return to later in the context of climate change. The first need identified at the Montpellier seminar is for more rigorous global comparative studies to overcome the tyranny of the case study. An enormous amount of effort has gone into attempts to retroactively tease out conclusions from heterogeneous studies that were not designed for that purpose. Our stakeholders want to know the answer to the following question. What is the relationship between community management of forests, livelihood outcomes, and forest condition outcomes? And it would be great to have an answer that goes beyond, it depends. Now, we've got some great examples of research out there, including the International Forest Resources and Institutions Program and its associated data set from 14 countries and 250 sites. Researchers associated with that program have already generated a number of papers suggesting answers to the question, telling us what specifically outcomes related to livelihoods and forest condition depend on. But I will boldly assert that there have been too few examples of research designed in this way, and our progress up the learning curve would have been accelerated had there been more of them sooner. The second need identified by participants in the Montpellier seminar is for more research that takes into account the political economy of forest management in the countries where we work. Broader political and economic forces condition the outcomes of individual community forestry initiatives more than we had originally thought. Of course, a lot of this research has already been done. It was clear from the earliest days of community forestry that states were quick to surrender management roles to communities where forests were already degraded and devolved to them responsibility for planting trees. But governments tended to be much more reluctant to give up control over land with valuable standing forests. We understand now that concentration of forest-related decision-making in capital cities leads to a systematic tilting of the playing field in favor of state and corporate elites at the expense of rural forest users, not least because of the economic rents to be captured. And we understand that one of the biggest challenges faced by community forestry is that the widely heralded processes of decentralization and devolution of forest management remain largely incomplete. But I'll boldly assert that overall, research attention to these factors has been too little and too late, and our progress up the learning curve might have been faster had we focused on them sooner. Let me now turn my attention to our new research challenge, forests, communities, and climate change. The two-way linkage between forests and climate change has been recognized for a long time among researchers, but the policy audience for such research is really brand new, and I would date it from the publication of the Stern Review in late 2006. So compared to research on forests and communities, which is now of a certain age, along with some of us who were its early practitioners, research on forests, communities, and climate change is still in its infancy. But the big questions have a familiar ring. Under what conditions, if any, can policies and programs for reducing emissions from deforestation and degradation, or REDD, be effective in terms of reducing emissions while also being equitable, not least with respect to local communities? Under what conditions, if any, can policies and programs to promote forest-related adaptation be effective in promoting local and societal resilience while also being equitable, again, not least with respect to local communities? And alas, we do not have the luxury of 25 years to answer these questions. This week's heat wave here in Seoul is only one of the many palpable hints that we should be listening to what the climate data is trying to tell us about the urgency of addressing these problems. But as we regroup for another summit ascent on the learning curve, let's pause to consider the challenges before us. The first is that while in theory the UNFCCC COP13 in Bali produced a roadmap, we really don't have one. Red is a quickly moving target. We went from red with one D to the second D to the plus in a matter of months. And it's not just that researchers can't agree on terminology, but negotiators are having trouble as well. And even as the theory of red, in terms of being an international payment for performance scheme, is not yet well elaborated or understood beyond a very small inner circle, the practice of red is getting underway in dozens of countries and demonstration projects as we speak. So our maps are constantly being outdated and practice is getting out ahead of theory. And if that weren't bad enough, the research community is under enormous pressure to have something useful to say about all of this in impossibly short time frames, driven by negotiation schedules and funding cycles. As a result, I fear that we will be tempted to fall back under the tyranny of the case study and selectively marshal evidence that supports our pre-existing views. The prospect of red seems to be functioning as something of a Rorschach test. Some look at it and see the possibility for all kinds of horrific unintended negative consequences for local communities, whereas others look at it and see all kinds of benefits for communities, including enhanced rural income opportunities and improved forest governance. Especially as researchers, we need to steer carefully between the scylla of being overly cynical about the possibility of positive change and the Charybdis of irrational exuberance about what red can possibly achieve. Both positive and negative outcomes are, of course, possible, and we need to focus our research effort on under what conditions and with what approaches we're more likely to produce the one or the other. Happily, early red research shows signs of accelerated progress up the learning curve, piggybacking on insights achieved through the decades of attention to communities and forests. Some colleagues have already demonstrated that the lack of clear forest tenure rights will be a severe constraint on payment-based red schemes. Others have used the IFRI dataset to illuminate how institutional arrangements affect forest condition and associated carbon density. Still others have enumerated the potential barriers to participation of the poor in red. And a small army of researchers in conservation organizations have analyzed how to minimize trade-offs and enhance synergies between red and biodiversity conservation. But this first generation of literature on red is of necessity speculative in nature, given that a global red mechanism does not yet exist. And indeed, a negotiated agreement appears to be receding on the horizon just now, and red policies and projects are just getting started. So the concept itself is being invented simultaneously in the context of both formal negotiations and associated pilot efforts at national and local levels. Nevertheless, a theme that appears across nearly all of the early red literature is that red creates a giant optimization problem, characterized by trade-offs among multiple objectives. So for all of these reasons, new research on forests and climate change needs to focus on empirical analysis of what actually happens as red and other policies and projects move from ideas to implementation on the ground. Before turning to implications for the way forward, let me just say a brief special word on adaptation. If anything, the challenges of designing research on communities and forest adaptation efforts are even greater than for those of red. The theory and practice of ecosystem-based adaptation is even less well developed. And as in other sectors, we've had trouble distinguishing conceptually between forest-related actions undertaken for adaptation and those that should be undertaken anyway in the interest of sustainable development. Agreement on financing and how to achieve equity in funding allocations is proving elusive. So research on the impacts of adaptation interventions is at this point even more speculative than on those of red, but at least as urgent.